Good evening. So, we're moving rapidly along with 3 men in the boat. So, let's move on to chapter 18. Chapter 18. Locks. George and I are photographed. Wallingford, Dorchester, Abingdon, a family man, a good spot for drowning, a difficult bit of water, demoralising effect of river air. We left Streatley early next morning and pulled up Culham and slept under canvas in a backwater there. The river is not extraordinarily interesting between Streatley and Wallingford. From Cleve you get a stretch of about 6.5 miles without a lock, and I believe this is the longest uninterrupted stretch anywhere above Teddington, and the Oxford Club make use of it for their trial 8s. But, however satisfactory the absence of the lock may be to rowing men, it is regretted by the mere pleasure seeker. For myself, I am fond of locks. They pleasantly break the monotony of the pull, and I like sitting in the boat and slowly rising out of the cool depths into new reaches and fresh views, or sinking down, as it were, out of the world, and then waiting whilst the gloomy gates creak and the narrow strip of the daylight between them widens until the fair smiling river rises before you, and you push your little boat out from its brief prison onto the welcoming waters once again. They are little picturesque spots, these locks. The stout old lockkeeper with his cheerful-looking wife or bright-eyed daughter are pleasant folk to have a passing chat with. Footnote. Or rather, were. The Conservancy of late seems to have constituted itself into a society for employment of idiots. A good many of the new lockkeepers, especially in the more crowded parts of the river, are excitable, nervous old men quite unfit for their posts. You meet other boats there, and the river gossip is exchanged. The Thames would not be the fairyland that it is without its flower-decked locks. Talking of locks reminds me of an accident George and I very nearly had one summer's morning at Hampton Court. It was a glorious day, and the lock was crowded, and, as is common practice up the river, a specular photographer was taking a picture of us as we lay upon the rising waters. I did not catch what was going on at first, and therefore was extremely surprised at noticing George hurriedly smoothing out his trousers, ruffled up his hair, and sticking his cap on at a rakish manner at the back of his head, and then, assuming an expression of mingled affability and sadness, sat down in a graceful attitude and tried to hide his feet. My first idea was that he had suddenly caught sight of some girl he knew, and I looked about to see who it was. Everybody in the lock seemed to be very suddenly struck wooden. They were all standing or sitting about in the most quaint and curious attitudes that I'd ever seen off a Japanese fan. All the girls were smiled. Oh, they did look so sweet. And the fellows were frowning and looking all stern and noble. And then, at last, the truth flashed across me, and I wondered if I should be in time. Ours was the first boat, and it would be unkind of me to spoil the man's picture, I thought. So I faced round quickly and took up position in the prow, where I leant with careless grace upon the hitcher, and in an attitude suggestive of agility and strength. I arranged my hair with a curl over the forehead, and threw an air of tender wistfulness into my expression, mingled with a touch of cynicism which I'm told suits me. As we stood waiting for the eventful moment, I heard somebody call out behind, "Hi, look to your nose!" I could not turn around to see what was the matter, and whose nose it was that needed to be looked at. I stole a side glance at George's nose. It was all right, at all events. There was nothing wrong with it that could be altered anyway. I squinted down at my own, and it seemed it could also be as expected. "Look at your nose, you stupid ass," came the same voice again, louder. And then another voice. "Push your nose out, can't you? You two with the dog." Neither George nor I dared to turn around. The man's hand was on the cap, and the picture might be taken any moment. What was it they were calling us to? What was the matter with our noses? Why were they being pushed out? But now the whole lock started yelling, and a stentorian voice from behind shouted, "Look at your boat, sir, you and the red and black caps. It's 2 corpses will get taken in that photo if you ain't quick." We then looked and saw that the nose of our boat had got fixed under the woodwork of the lock, whilst the incoming water was rising all around and tilting it up. In another moment it would be over. As quick as a thought, we each seized an oar, and a vigorous blow against the side of the lock with the butt ends released the boat and sent us sprawling on our backs. We did not come out well in that photograph, George and I. Of course, as was to be expected, our luck ordained it, and that man should set his wretched machine in motion at the precise moment we were both lying on our backs, with wild expressions of "Where am I?" and "What is this?" on our faces, and our 4 feet waving madly in the air. Our feet were undoubtedly the leading article in that photograph. Indeed, very little else was to be seen. They filled up the foreground entirely. Behind them you caught glimpses of other boats and bits of surrounding scenery, but everything and everybody else in the loch looked so utterly insignificant and paltry compared with our feet. That and all the other people felt quite ashamed of themselves and refused to subscribe to the picture. The owner of one steam launch, who had bespoken 6 copies, rescinded the order on seeing the negative. He said he would take them if anyone could show him his launch, but nobody could. It was there somewhere behind George's right foot. There was a good deal of unpleasantness over the business. The photographer thought that we ought to take a dozen copies each, seeing that the photo was about 9/10 us, but we declined. We said we had no objection to being photoed full length, but we preferred to be taken the right way up. Wallingford, 6 miles above Streatley, is a very ancient town and has been an active centre for the making of English history. It was a rude, mud-built town in the time of the Britons, who squatted there until the Roman legions evicted them, and then replaced their clay-baked walls with mighty fortifications, the trace of which the time has not yet succeeded in sweeping away. So well those old-world masons knew how to build. But time, though he halted at Roman walls, soon crumbled the Romans to dust, and on that ground in later years fought the savage Saxons and huge Danes, until the Normans came, and it was a walled and fortified town up in the time of Parliament. It was a walled and fortified town up in the time of Parliamentary war. It was a walled and fortified town up in the time of the Parliamentary War, when it suffered a long and bitter siege from Fairfax. It fell at last, and then the walls were raised. From Wallingford up to Dorchester, the neighbourhood of the river grows more hilly and varied, and picturesque. Dorchester stands half a mile from the river. It can be reached by paddling up the Thames if you have a small boat. But the best way is to leave the river at Days Lock and take a walk across the fields. Dorchester is a delightfully peaceful old place, nestling in the stillness and silence and drowsiness. Dorchester, like Wallingford, is a city in ancient British times, and it was then called Ser Doran, the city on the water. In more recent times, the Romans formed a great camp here, the fortifications surrounding which now seem to lie like low, even hills. Even in Saxon days, it was the capital of Wessex. It is very old, and it was very strong and great once. Now it sits aside from the stirring world and nods and dreams. Around Cliftonhampton, itself a wonderfully pretty village, old-fashioned, peaceful, and dainty with flowers, the scenery is rich and beautiful. If you stay on of a night and land at Clifton, you cannot do better than to stay at Barley Mow. It is without exception, I should say, the quaintest, most old-walled inn up the river. It stands on the right of the bridge, quite away from the village. its low pitched gables, thatched roof and lattice windows give it quite the storybook appearance, whilst inside it is even still more once upon a timeified. It would not be a good place for a heroine of a modern novel to stay at. The heroine of a modern novel is always divinely tall, and she is ever drawing herself up to her full height. At Barley Mow, she would bump her head against the ceiling each time she did this. It would also be a bad house for a drunken man to be put up at. There are far too many surprises in the way of unexpected steps down into this room or up into that. And as for getting up the stairs to the bedroom, or ever finding his bed when he got up there, either operation would be an utter impossibility to him. We were up early next morning as we wanted to be in Oxford by the afternoon. It is surprising how early one can get up when camping out. One does not yearn for the just another 5 minutes nearly so much when lying wrapped up in a rug on the boards of a boat with a Gladstone bag for a pillow as one does in a feather bed. We had finished breakfast and were through Clifton Lock by 8:30. From Clifton to Culham, the riverbanks were flat, monotonous and uninteresting. But after you get through Culham Lock, the coldest and deepest lock on the river, the landscape improves. At Abingdon, the river passes by the streets. Abingdon is a typical country town of the smaller order, quiet and eminently respectable, clean and desperately dull. It prides itself with being old, but whether it can compare in this respect with Wallingford and Dorchester seems doubtful. A famous abbey stood here once, and within what is left of its sanctified walls, they now brew bitter ale nowadays. In St Nicholas Church at Abingdon, there is a monument to John Blackwell and his wife Jane, who both, after leading a happily married life, died on the same day, August 21st, 1625. And in St Helen's Church it was recorded that W. Lee, who died in 1637, had in his lifetime issued from his loins 200, lacking but 3. If you work this out, you'll find Mr. W. Lee's family numbered 197. Mr. W. Lee, 5 times the mayor of Abingdon, was no doubt a benefactor to his generation, but I hope there are not many of his kind about in this overcrowded 19th century. From Abingdon to Newnham Courtney is a lovely stretch. Newnham Park is well worth a visit, and it can be viewed on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The house contains a fine collection of pictures and curiosities, and the grounds are beautiful. The pool under Sanford Lasher, just behind the lock, is a very good place to drown yourself in. The undercurrent is terribly strong, and if you once get down into it, you are all right. An obelisk marks the spot where 2 men have already been drowned while bathing there, and the steps of the obelisk are generally used as a diving board by young men now who wish to see if the place really is dangerous. Iffley Lock and Mill, a mile before you reach Oxford, is a favourite subject of the river-loving brethren of the brush. The real article, however, is rather disappointing after the pictures. Few things I've noticed come up quite to the pictures of them as in the wild. We passed through Iffley Lock at about 12:30, and then, having tidied up the boat and made all ready for landing, we set to work on our last mile. Between Iffley and Oxford is the most difficult bit of the river I know. You want to be born on that bit of river. To be born on that bit of the river is understand it. I've been over it a fairish number of times, but I've never been able to get the hang of it. The man who could row straight course from Oxford to Iffley ought to be able to live comfortably under one roof with his wife, his mother-in-law, his eldest sister, and the old servant who is in the family since when they was a baby. First the current drives you onto the right bank, and then onto the left, and it takes you out into the middle, and turns you round 3 times, and carries you up the stream again, and always ends by trying to smash you up against a college barge. Of course, as a consequence of all of this, we got in the way of a good many other boats during the mile, and they in ours, and of course, as a consequence of that, a good deal of bad language occurred. I don't know why it should be, but everybody is always so exceptionally irritable on the river. Little mishaps that you'd hardly notice on dry land drive you to nearly frantic rage when they occur on water. When Harris or George makes an ass of himself on dry land, I smile indulgently. When they behave in a chuckle-headed way on the river, I use the most blood-curdling language to them. When another boat gets in my way, I feel I want to take an oar and kill all the people on it. The mildest-tempered people, when on land, become violent and bloodthirsty when in a boat. I did a little boating once with a young lady. She was naturally the sweetest and gentlest disposition imaginable. But on the river, it was quite awful to hear her. "Oh, drat that man," she would exclaim, when some unfortunate sculler would get in her way. "Why didn't he look where he was going?" And, "Oh, the bother the silly old thing," she would say indignantly, when the sail would not go up properly, and she would catch hold of it and shake it quite brutally. Yet, as I have said, when on shore she was kind-hearted and amiable enough. The air of the river has a demoralising effect on one's temper, and this is, I suppose, what causes even bargemen to be sometimes rude to one another, and to use language which, no doubt in their calmer moments, they would regret. End of chapter 18. Well, that's the end of chapter 18. I hope that everyone out there is staying as safe as you can be, and that you're all well with your families. Take care, and we'll see you later for chapter 19. Have a good day.